Hello everyone and welcome back to a Hearts of Iron 4 dev diary for Arms Against Tyranny. This week we're going to be talking about historical Sweden as opposed to alternatively non-historical Sweden, I suppose. But, before we do so, I thought I'd take a small moment to talk about something I noticed in my previous video talking about historical Finland. So on the screen before us we can see the Finland historic focus tree, or as much as we know about it thus far. There seemed to be some misconception that I was under the belief that a bigger focus tree is a better focus tree because, as we can see, the Finnish focus tree as we see it here is not as big as other focus trees like Poland or Italy or the Soviets. This wasn't quite my point. I think it should go without saying that quantity does not always equal quality, and a small focus tree that's really good will always be better than a big focus tree that nobody wants to play. My actual point that I think kind of got lost under the radar was about the formulaic nature of how it was presented. So as we can see here, there seems to be what is very similar to a generic focus tree. We have the political section on the left, we have our industry section, and then we've got our three branches for land, air and navy. Very formulaic. In case you're wondering what I mean by this, if we look at the generic focus tree, here we can see that this is basically the game's structure of creating focus trees since its very release. 5 key branches: politics, industry, navy, aviation and army, and I really felt like the Finland focus tree didn't stray too far from that example. Then, if we were to look at something like the Polish tree, which as you can see here is very big, it also serves to show you something else. So I think the Poland focus tree is so good, not necessarily because of its size, but because of the amount of different branches it has. So we've got one here for dealing with Danzig. We've got one over here to do with war plans, so active war plans, which is actually separate than your army and air tree. It's its own individual war plans section. And at the end you get an additional 2 branches, one dedicated to building a faction, and one dedicated to intelligentsia and operatives. And I always felt like these very small branches, not exactly extreme in any way, really added a lot because it just built up more choices of where you had to spend your time. Now, I'm not saying the Finland focus tree is going to be bad because it doesn't show this. It was merely a point of how I felt like the Finland focus tree was looking pretty formulaic. So now that we've looked at some of the ideas of smaller branches, let's take a look at the historical Swedish focus tree and see if it matches up with Finland or matches closer to Poland. Välkommen! The dev diary, similar to the Finland dev diary, begins by giving us some context to the situation that Sweden finds itself in, as being one of the few countries in World War II that wasn't actually subject to an invasion. As a result, the devs have had to build a focus tree that really has to balance the ideas of being involved in a war without necessarily being literally committed to the war with soldiers fighting it out on the front lines. As such, the focus tree before us may have options to deal with dealing with a welfare state as opposed to its military, as well as dealing in trade with the allied nations, and maybe preparing for a counter-offensive later on if you choose to join them. Note that they say that the AI, however, will not be joining the Allies and going against Germany in the end. This is only something that you will be working towards in the focus tree because, well, I don't think many people want to play Hoi 4 and necessarily not get into any conflict, unless you're maybe going for like a massive Gamer Bhutan gameplay. So in the beginning there was the words, and the words were Defense Act, and the Defense Act focus is what's going to allow you to, at the beginning of the game, deal with the leader of your nation. There are 4 leaders for you to choose from in total, and they give you a preview of what each of them look like here in this chaotic period of 1936 called the Summer Government. So we've got Axel here, who isn't the best in the world in terms of changing up your laws, but gives you some little war support. I don't think he's too great, to be honest. Clearly the fallen Reichstag doesn't look too brilliant either though, probably the worst one listed here. We've got a guy called Gusta, I think, who certainly looks like he frequents a barber, but in terms of actual buffs that he gives you as a character, again, the war support and infantry equipment isn't necessarily the strongest in the world. And later on, we find an old familiar eyebrows and a new character entirely, with Per Albin Hansen giving us some actually relatively decent buffs, although the war support negative modifier is unfortunate, and Ernst, our main man Ernst, who doesn't come with any negative modifiers, but does give us some civ factory construction speed, and in my experience, that's always good. So continuing on with the dev diary, we now find ourselves talking about Hungershield and Folkhemmet, or Hungershield and Folkhemmet. I don't know, the interchangeability between Swedish and English seems to vary. In short, these appear to be the key national spirits that are going to guide mostly the early to mid-game of your Sweden playthrough. So Hungershield is wordplay in the offset of the fear of food shortages coming from World War II, and is effectively going to be a great deal of stress and eventually strikes from your people should stability get too low. As we can see in this image here, once you get below 65%, unrest strikes can begin, and if you go below 30, riots can begin. I know that strikes are in the game already, but riots, they seem pretty bad indeed. However, it does say that this spirit is removed if you get 35 civilian factories, so really just building up a big civilian economy at the start of the game to avoid having your entire country revolt against you seems like the way to go. I guess this is also a way to kind of push you towards not necessarily going for a mass expansionist Sweden in the early game and having a build-up period. I do have to say though, I do like the idea that there's like a goal of reaching a civilian industry cap to kind of say that you have reached a goal and you can move on to do other things. I do like that. And further down we get to see these riots in their totality. Political power gain is in the toilet, production efficiency growth is effectively non-existent, your factories and dockyards are useless, and you can't even build any dockyards. An unfortunate time. The next concept is Folkhemmet, or the People's Home, which, as we all remember, is the communist Sweden. I think once you convert communist, your country's name becomes Folkhemmet. But in this, it's now a national spirit, which is basically a balance between the social welfare programs that Sweden has, produced by the stability that you get from the national spirit, versus the militarization of Sweden towards building mills, building equipment, building ships. It seems in this regard that the two cannot coexist, so you're going to need to pick between having high stability or having high war support. And as we saw in the previous national spirit, high stability is going to be pretty useful early on, so probably keeping some level of Folkhemmet is going to be the difference between riots and a stable nation. They show an example here with the naval focus tree and a focus called is that Gotterverken, in which you modify Folkhemmet to give war support, but you start losing some civ factory construction speed and stability, and since we need those civs, taking this focus a little bit too early could maybe screw you over. And Sweden kind of starts with a decent sized navy anyway, so I don't know why you'd want to rush this. Moving on, we see the end result of a fully militarized Swedish war industry with minus 23 stability, but plus 20 war support and good mill and dockyard construction. By the way, minus 28 civ factory construction speed is very painful, so let's really hope that you've got your country geared up by that point. It also does look like, if you look in the background, that Sweden is not called Sweden. There's no M in Sweden. So I guess this is like a communist playthrough, where if you go full communist and fully kind of militarize Sweden, you get this national spirit, because this looks like it says Folkhemmet. With the two national spirits now covered, we can move on to looking at the focus trees, and we begin by looking at the industrial branch, which, as we see, is filled with a decent chunk of mutually exclusive focuses, and is kind of just following down the nice path of picking between left and right, and really customizing what you want your Swedish industry to look like. As I mentioned earlier, the Defence Act is the first focus you'll probably be picking in the game, assuming there's no other introductory focuses in the alt history branches. So picking up Defence Act is the focus that's going to have you choose your leader. Because of the mutually exclusive nature of some of the focuses, they get to show us what some of the alternative options look like. So here we've got the, wish me luck, Soltjobbaden agreement, in which you choose to either accept it or reject it. So far as I can tell, the agreement was formed between the trade union and the Employers Association in Sweden in terms of trying to end any disagreements that could lead to strikes, and is a model of many other agreements that I think is still standing to this day. So in that regard, one can assume that accepting the agreement is the historical path, which does give you some consumer goods factories factor, but also gives you some production efficiency cap and war penalty stability. Really trying to make sure that those strikes don't happen in the event that you do find yourself going into a war. Hungershield is just around the corner after all. On the flip side, you can choose to give them the middle finger, which gives you some war support, and the stability does drop down because this does run the risk of starting a few strikes and riots. The next mutually exclusive focuses are poverty reduction, which aims to give you a civ and some democracy and communism with a little bit of stability, so pretty straightforward. Do you want a free civ? Or do you want defense above all, which gives you 1 mil? So yeah, pretty simple decision there. Not really too much to decipher, but considering that civs are pretty important to Sweden, you might find yourself picking the civ. At the bottom of the right-hand path of the industrial tree, the more right-leaning policies it seems, is economic deregulation, which removes Folkhemmet entirely and then adds economic deregulation as a spirit, giving you consumer goods factory factor, which I think is a negative thing by the way, minus 10 stability, but the war support goes up, and the mill and dockyard construction speed goes up. I'm not too sure how good this sounds, if I'm being completely honest. Folkhemmet being the security helm that it currently is, I really feel like you have to have really managed your stability very well to get to the point where you can just dunk it into the ocean. Alternatively, following down the right hand side of the tree, near the bottom we've got the SFK ball bearings focus. This seems to open up a screen that looks something like this, where you get decisions to trade ball bearings with other countries. Here we see we're trying to set the terms of trade with the Soviet Union, and if they accept, we seem to get some fighter production, basically planes in general, and a good amount of experience. But there are other things you can ask for too in the trade. Foodstuffs, knowledge, I assume this is like research or maybe some licenses, and the last one we simply don't know. The dev diary seems to go sideways at this point by stopping talking about the national focus tree and talking about flashpoints, which seem to be just historical events that unfold throughout the game. So I assume this is similar to things like the Hindenburg crashing and Amelia Earhart, but in this one you'll actually have some decisions to choose between. Here we see a Soviet air raid which runs the risk of some stability going down but some war support going up by spooking the people of Soviet aggression. The next one seems to be the USSR accidentally bombing Sweden, in which case again you might have to deal with the outrage of the Swedish people, really just using the threat of the Soviets as a justification to militarize your country. And as it continues, you may find yourself actually using these events to get more involved in the war, such as the Winter War, by sending off equipment to Finland in response, and then perhaps finding yourself in conflict with the Soviets. So I wonder if these events are similar to the Japanese when they sink a ship, and the USA gets an event similar to this where they get to immediately enter war with the Japanese, because that's the kind of vibe I'm getting from it. Oh yes, indeed, eventually once you find yourself at the bottom, Sweden can give you the middle finger and the Soviets can come to puppet you. That is quite the expanded Winter War. After that brief pit stop, we're returning to the national focus tree, and this time we're talking about the military branch. So let's take a quick look. Okay, so we've got our navy tree on the left, looking like a nice little navy tree. I do like this focus for buying a ship here. On this side, I think this is your Air Force branch. These appear to be tanks and motorized on this side. Maybe this is just a few mills. And I would assume that this is therefore your land infantry combat. So following down the right-hand path, we have the focus as the barometer falls. So if the following is true, more than 35 war support and at least 17 military factories. I actually really like this. I do like the idea that focuses are locked out unless you specialize your nation towards that goal. I am actually a fan of this, and if you do so, you gain war games, which gives you some actually really good daily ticking experience game. That is quite a lot, isn't it? And it's for a very long time. So on the flip side of dealing with the issues of Hungershield, on the other side, you're missing out on the great experience you could be gaining from war games. Moving further on down, you might eventually get to mobilization of society, which grants you 2,250 weekly manpower. So that's basically a decent division at the end of a month. Really good defense, but your stability and war support is going to tank itself into the ground. This is really, I guess, this almost feels like a desperate kind of situation where you need to very quickly spawn a ton of units and maybe get your line bolstered and maybe build up some forts, but yeah, that stability and war support debuff is really, really damaging. Maybe try not to lose the Winter War if you find yourself against the Soviets. Into the middle of the focus tree branch, for moving closer towards air, we find Bofur's Fly Swatter, which has some wonderful art of a little fly getting swatted there. Pretty standard though in its anti-air boost and some funds towards the new system that, again, I'm just so indecisive about whether I like it or not. I just need to actually use it to be able to tell you. It might be really, really good. In my mind, for some reason, I think modders could maybe do something insane with this. The idea that there's a system of like using funds to specialize into things, I can totally see someone using this for some crazy purpose. But in terms of this, it's definitely to me going to be something I'll feel if it's good or not when we actually try it out. With that, we actually get to see what it would look like in this. I assume this is still somewhat work in progress, but maybe this is generally what it's going to look like in its finalized version for the Swedish anti-air department. And they have a very specific off-branch for Bofur's Fly Swatters, where you can stick the funds in, I guess that's why they give you the funds up front, to immediately get this and get 8% air attack. It's almost like a mini doctrine, isn't it really? It is like a wholesome little mini doctrine, and you, instead of spending XP, you're spending funds. And onto the left side, we have the Navy branch, led by Gutterverken, which I mentioned earlier. So they say that the Sweden's navy tree is mainly divided into whether you want to contest the Baltics with your capital ships, or try and go with the submarine route and just screw over anybody who wants to trade. Methinks the Soviets in this regard. So at the top we find that there is the main point of being able to purchase ships from other countries, such as some British destroyers or German U-boats or old American destroyers. As a slightly offside thing, I actually think that the idea of being able to buy ships off other countries should be opened up more widely. I understand that in its current form, it's very focus tree dependent, such as like with Portugal having a decision to exchange a civ in exchange for equipment and stuff. But in general, I think the ability to just trade a ship over like a year period feels like something that could be more universally made. Note: historically, the Italian destroyers might make a round trip through the world and end up in Iceland. Okay, just be cautious of pressing the Italian decision then. That might screw you over. If you are going down the path of trying to dominate the Baltics, then you might want to pick up Vasa 2, which is supposed to be the more upgraded version of Vasa 1, which perhaps didn't go too well. And in this you'll get buffs to having it as your pride of the fleet, in general having buffs with the pride of the fleet, and you just get the variant up front. Okay friends, are you still with me? Because I do believe we've got what can only be described as a mini sub-branch coming up, in which you'll have to choose how well you're dealing with the Winter War. So as it appears, it looks like we're going to have 3 key choices to choose between. One of them seems to involve sending over personnel, but not necessarily involving Sweden as an individual. Another of them is dealing with the island, or islands, I guess, of Åland. And then finally, Finland's cause is our own, which one can only assume is getting involved firsthand. They described that while the Åland Islands is pretty much as we thought, trying to deal with them and maybe get them on your side to have a bolster against the Soviets, getting involved directly will get you into the war and give you the mission of taking Leningrad to try and peace out the Soviets. You also, because you're besties with Finland now, get national spirits each to represent you helping the other. So Sweden, I assume, gets stopping the Red Threat, which gives them some division org, which is great, attack against a major country, which is really great, and breakthrough against major country, which is really, really great. On the flip side, you've got Finland getting a morale boost from Swedish backup, which gives you the same buffs. So in general, you can imagine a Finland player really, really hoping that the Sweden has their back on this one. Later on, if you're successful with all that really good breakthrough that you've acquired, Leningrad might be lost, and the Soviets will have to decide if they're going to sue for peace or try and carry on with the embarrassment, which gives them a frankly awful national spirit. Embarrassment of the Red Army. Look at that division org debuff, division attack. No, you do not want this. Democratic branch. I like these little sections. They're quite short. You can just tiptoe through them and move on to the next. So this is the only political branch we're going to be seeing because this is the historical focus tree section. So they describe that Sweden did not enter the war historically, but they do have preparation and build-up so that if you do want to just nudge it on that slight bit to joining them, then this is a focus tree path that you can take. Or you could not and literally play the whole game without ever joining a war if you choose to. But the whole point is to build up to eventually join the Allies should you want to actually commit to the final push. One of the examples given is Train the Sheltered, which is effectively you asking for foreign soldiers to come into your country under the guise of being trained as policemen and the sort, so that eventually you can just whip up army out of the blue to fight the Germans out of Scandinavia. There appears to be a random beep beep on my screen. So this beep beep is the mobile headquarters that the Swedish government had planned being the key word here, to run away into the forest with in case of invasion. I don't know how you fit an entire government into that bus, but maybe it's like a clown car or a TARDIS or something. It's bigger on the inside. This is represented in-game with a national spirit, which is basically to do with resistance growth and compliance growth, so that you can really make sure that the enemy has no place in Sweden, as well as a very interesting mechanic to do with moving the bus around the states that you own. It doesn't look like necessarily you can move it to Gotland though. This is an outrage. So for every state that you control, and it doesn't necessarily say own, you can move your bus over to that state. Should the bus get captured though, your country leader will die. Yeah, he just gets captured. So just be cautious that the bus isn't captured, because your leader is inside that bus, just so you know. It's kind of a funny mechanic, isn't it, really? It's a semi-silly but kind of funny mechanic. My advice would really just be to absolutely fortify Stockholm, but if you want to move into the absolute freezing wastes of the north, I guess that option is available to you. This section continues by describing aspects that you can take, including decisions like sabotaging vital enemy infrastructure to really make sure that the Germans are screwed over, I guess the Soviets too, should they find yourself in your or any allied land, which moves you on to the first focus, the cross we bear. This continues the trend with every Nordic country that is occupied, getting some org loss and org loss when moving, and generally just making it unfortunate for anyone who shouldn't be there to be there. Oh, and you also get a little bit of recruitable population too. Just to reiterate that this is formed from countries being occupied, and then the bonus at the end comes from them being liberated. So you get the recruitable population for every Nordic country that is freed, meaning this actually stacks up past 0.5 to be, I guess, 1 should you get Denmark as well as Norway. And then if you find yourself moving into, I don't know, the Netherlands, maybe that adds on to it if you're in the Allies, that could really stack up. The Nordic Defence Council. Oh my goodness, it's another sub-branch. So a little bit of the art appears to be missing, but in general this seems to be a faction-forming sub-branch. Not too big, but not too bad either. Let's take a look. The key takeaway I'm getting from this is, if you go down this branch, Sweden is no longer called Sweden and is called the Nordic Defence Council, with every other nation, like Norway and Denmark and whatnot, being constituents of that Defence Council. So as we see here with a centralised Nordic Army Command, the manpower and the units of all the members get transferred over to the Nordic Defence Council. In this regard, it's almost like you're becoming the caretaker of the Nordic nations, and you are responsible for their defence. Or perhaps you could go a more decentralised route, where you don't want all of your allies to lose their army and whatnot, and they can deal with it slightly better on their own. Perhaps this could be the better one, because every member of the council gets extensive conscription, as well as some good buffs towards war support, surrender limit, mobilisation speed, and training time. Ah yes, here's the image of confirmation. So it really does seem like you're kind of making a Nordic Union empire, but with all of them being constituent puppet states of a wider alliance. This is actually a really interesting little idea, isn't it? I wonder what it's like playing as one of the other nations and experiencing becoming a puppet under the Nordic Defence Council. I wonder if it's fun, or if you're an unfortunate British Malaysia gameplay. Should you find yourself getting to the bottom of the Nordic Defence Council, you'll get add neither death nor dishonour. Now I swear I've heard that one before, which should give you some increasing buffs towards defence, attack, factory output and dockyard output. The bigger your alliance grows, the bigger the buffs. As a final note on this, I do notice that Iceland is independent in this alliance, as just a minor thing, but I'm also wondering to what extent other nations might want to be involved. I feel like there's an argument to maybe get Estonia, maybe just the Baltics in general might be interested in this, and maybe if Poland somehow is still going, maybe they might be interested in this, assuming that you've got the Baltics involved. For the final section of the Dev Diary covering the focuses, we've got the late game focuses as an independent branch, and this is going to be about your real end game strategy. The focus on the right there, the threat of the Iron Curtain, almost looks like it's heading into a Cold War era, so yeah, maybe really, really late game. The Line of the North Rises gives you a very wholesome national spirit, just giving you some stability, some war support, and some division attack. Although I am interested if you're in the truly late game, I'm surprised you haven't got that all figured out by then. But it's a nice focus, I like the art. With that, the remainder of the Dev Diary is just going to be going over some of the other aspects that we usually find in Dev Diaries, including looking at the different types of advisors you have. Sadly, there's no white liberal here, or at least none that I can see. I did think it's funny that some people actually thought, perhaps, that I didn't get that white liberal was in regards to like the whites versus the reds in Finland, and thought it genuinely meant the modern day white liberal. Don't worry, I'm not that clueless. Further down, we see that there are decisions in regards to a woman called Ebba. We can actually see her as an advisor, a suffragette here, which is encouraging women in more places and reducing the wage gap. More interesting than that, they've actually added a mechanic that when certain advisors get hired and also fired, there are consequences. So in this case, we've got Gunnar. He's like a fine guy. He gets rid of Fash, he builds up civs. He's a nice guy. But when he comes in with, I think, Alva, you gain stability. And when fired, you gain stability. They've actually added in what appears to be like a hiring and firing mechanic. So in this case, we've got Gunnar, who's a pretty decent guy, you know, civ construction speed, reducing Fash. If he's hired in tandem with Alva Myrdal, you gain partners in a dangerous time, which gives you just a little bit of stability, and consequently when you fire him, you lose partners in dangerous time. We see it again with Alva here, Alva Myrdal, who gives you monthly population and weekly manpower. That's kind of a very wholesome little one. I feel like minor nations should have somebody like this. But then, yep, when hired in with Gunnar, so this is the flip side, they get civilian factory construction speed, and then fired, losing civilian factory construction speed. So you kind of need to mix and match them together. Just breezing through here, but you see lots of lovely generals, many of them having traits, and one of them being pixelated. I don't know why this guy's a secret, maybe he's old history. Charles the Champ is looking like an absolute champ. My goodness, did somebody tell him that the Napoleonic Wars are over? Sorry. We get a good look at Sweden in its now more dissected state segments. Very similar to what happened with Finland, where you see it all getting divided up, where the big like mono-states have kind of been divided up a bit better. I feel like also you can get a little glimpse of Norway. Nordland and Helgeland and this one are much smaller than they used to be. I feel like Norway was like maybe 3 or 4 states before. So yeah, definitely been segmented up in Norway too. For the absolute final section of this Dev Diary, we're going to be briefly looking at resource distribution. So, as some of you may know, Sweden was a massive resource hub. It still is in the current version of Hoi 4. But they really wanted to rework how that interacted with Germany, because as it stands, Germany is, getting a lot of its steel perhaps, or other resources from Sweden. And I think that's something they really wanted to specialize in this DLC. So, in order to try and make it so that Germany has a massive focus on making sure that it has access to Sweden and its steel, they've actually giga-nerfed Germany, and I mean giga-nerfed. Take a look at this. After the DLC and pre the DLC. So pre the DLC, they're making almost 400 steel. Now they're barely pushing past 100. You are going to need to trade with Sweden to get the steel. I'm sorry, I don't think the additional tungsten is a consolation. Similar stories are looking to happen in France. Again, it's like being halved. Just very painful. Even the rubber's gone down. So the majors are taking some big hits here. Portugal also on the reduction here with their tungsten. Very sad. But Sweden is very good times in Sweden. Not just a buff to their steel, but a huge buff to their aluminium. Or aluminum, if you prefer. So Sweden, a massive trade hub in the next DLC. With that, we come to the end of the dev diary, which I guess we can leave by looking at a focus tree image of the whole focus tree. Ah yes, I think I'm right in suggesting this one certainly looks bigger than Finland. At least it's got the height to it that the Finnish tree didn't have, with lots of top secret stuff hidden in the corners. I do like it, I really do like it. I do have to say that the introductory part where I was talking about the sub-branches, I feel like this focus tree is the perfect example of how I do like focus trees to be in contrast to Finland, because these little sub-branches like the Nordic defense thing, the late game branch, the winter war branch, these are all really good and were kind of what I was expecting with Finland, but it's really good to see them with Sweden, and I'm excited to see how it plays out when we finally get our hands on it. With that, I'll say thank you very much for watching. I'm not entirely sure what it's going to be next week. Statistically saying it's going to be Norway or Denmark historical, but who knows, could throw a spanner in the works. To see that content and more future content, please feel free to like, feel free to subscribe, and I'll see you all next time. I don't know how to say bye in Sweden. Is it something like hej då?